currently heard.
It was September 30th in the year 1822 that Joseph Marion Hernandez became the first Hispanic to be elected to the United States Congress. Born a Spanish citizen, Hernandez would continue his eternity in Cuba, but in between, he became the first non-white person to serve at the highest levels of any three branches of the American federal government. Hernandez belonged to a St. Augustine family that came to Florida as indentured servants. Despite these humble beginnings, records show that his family eventually became wealthy enough to own property and several slaves, and that Hernandez was educated both in Georgia and in Cuba. Throughout the 1810s, the United States made a variety of efforts to take Florida from the Spanish, finally succeeding after Andrew Jackson led an army through the territory in the First Seminole War. What Hernandez did during this time is unclear, but he was either very savvy or very lucky. He fought the Americans during the war and received substantial amounts of land from the Spanish government, but then pledged loyalty to the United States and was allowed to keep his 3 plantations when the territory changed hands in 1819. It was then that Hernandez changed his name from Jose Mariano to Joseph Marion. The newly acquired Florida territory was allowed to elect a delegate to Congress, but that delegate did not have voting privileges. Florida's Legislative Council elected Hernandez to represent the territory. During his brief tenure, he served for less than a year before losing his re-election bid. Hernandez was instrumental in facilitating the transition from Spanish to American government in Florida. In addition to securing the property rights of many Floridians who remained after the annexation, he also advocated for roads and infrastructure to bind the new territory together and make it an attractive candidate for statehood. He went on to fight in the Second Seminole War, helping his adopted nation drive the natives from its new territory. The war saw the loss of his 2 plantations, however, as well as the destruction of his political ambitions after he was involved in an incident in which an American contingent captured a number of Seminoles despite approaching them under a flag of truce. Hernandez later served as mayor of St. Augustine before retiring to Cuba, where he continued his eternity in 1857. In the year 1889, the Wyoming State Convention approves a constitution that includes a provision granting women the right to vote. Formally admitted into the Union the following year, Wyoming thus became the first state in the history of the nation to allow its female citizens to vote. Leading suffragists like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were Easterners, and they assumed that their own more progressive home states would be among the first to respond to the campaign for women's suffrage. Yet the people and politicians of the growing number of new Western states proved far more supportive than those in the East. In 1848, the legislature in Washington Territory became the first to introduce a women's suffrage bill. Though the Washington bill was narrowly defeated, similar legislation succeeded elsewhere, and Wyoming Territory was the first to give women the vote in 1869, quickly followed by Utah Territory in 1870 and Washington Territory in 1883. As with Wyoming, when these territories became states, they preserved women's suffrage. By 1914, the contrast between East and West had become striking. All of the states west of the Rockies had women's suffrage, while no state did east of the Rockies, except Kansas. Why the regional distinction? Some historians suggest Western men may have been rewarding pioneer women for their critical role in settling the West. Others argue the West had a more egalitarian spirit, or that the scarcity of women in some Western regions made men more appreciative of the women who were there, while hoping the vote might attract more. Whatever the reasons, Westerners proved far more willing than other Americans to create states where most women were welcomed as full and equal citizens. On September 30th in 1962, in Oxford, Mississippi, James H. Meredith, an African-American student, is escorted onto the University of Mississippi campus by U.S. Marshals, setting off a deadly riot. 2 men continued their eternity before the violence was quelled by more than 3,000 federal soldiers. The next day, Meredith successfully enrolled and began to attend classes amid continuing disruption. A former serviceman in our nation's United States Air Force, Meredith applied and was accepted to the University of Mississippi in 1962. But his admission was revoked when the registrar learned of his skin tone. A federal court ordered Ole Miss to admit him, but when he tried to register on September 20th in 1962, he found the entrance of the office blocked by Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett. On September 28, the governor was found guilty of civil contempt and was ordered to cease his interference with desegregation at the university or face arrest and a fine of $10,000 a day. 2 days later, Meredith was escorted onto the Ole Miss campus by U.S. Marshals. Turned back by violence, he returned the next day and began classes. Meredith, who was a transfer student from the all-black Jackson State College, graduated with a degree in political science in 1963. In 1966, Meredith returned to the public eye when he began a lone civil rights march in an attempt to encourage voter registration by African Americans in the South. During this march against fear, Meredith intended to walk from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi. However, on June 6, just 2 days into the march, he was sent to a hospital by a sniper's bullet. Other civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr. and Stokely Carmichael, arrived to continue the march on his behalf. It was during the March Against Fear that Carmichael, who was leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, first spoke publicly of Black Power, his concept of militant African American nationalism. James Meredith later recovered and rejoined the march he had originated, and on June 26, the marchers successfully reached Jackson, Mississippi. Some 4,000 Black Americans registered to vote during the march. All historic information divulged and documented on this audio file can be verified on history.com.